Okay, so welcome to this segment as I talk about light. So a few concepts that you need to remember under this one. We'll talk about rectilinear propagation of light. Now, what should come to your mind when you hear of rectilinear propagation of light? Well, it's simply a theory that states that light travels in a straight line. So if you want, you can say this is a theory. So this is a theory that states that light travels in a straight line. So that is what we call a rectilinear propagation of light. So it's a theory that tells us that light travels in a straight line. Now I want you to understand that light will only travel in a straight line when there is an obstacle between the source and the reception point. So if you have got maybe the source of light, if you have got the source of light and let me say the reception point here, but there's an obstacle. Let's say that there's an obstacle that is available along the path of the source of light, such that light is actually blocked. Then you're going to find that if at all there's an obstacle, light will not travel in a straight line. But of course, if at all there's no obstacle, it simply means that if we were to remove this obstacle, it simply means that light would actually travel in a straight line. So that is what we mean. But of course, when there's an obstacle, it simply means that light will not be able to to pass through. And because of having an obstacle and light is not able to pass through, it simply means that it will create the formation of what we call as being shadows. So therefore, let's focus on our discussion as we look at shadow formation. How are shadows formed? So like I mentioned, shadows are formed when light rays strike an opaque object. So when light rays strike an opaque object, an object through which light cannot pass through, that is what we simply call as being an opaque object. Then it simply means that shadows are going to be formed. Let's say that this is an object that we have that is actually opaque, and we have got a source of light. You are going to find that if rays are coming in that direction, there will be those that are going to hit this opaque object are going to be absorbed, and maybe some may be reflected, but some of the light may actually pass alongside the opaque object. And therefore you can see that this region somewhere here where light is not falling, this region where light is not falling here, this is going to create what we call as being a shadow. But going this side, you'll find that light has actually passed through, and therefore you're going to have sources of light. Now I want you to understand that the kind of shadow that is formed by light hitting or striking an opaque object depends on the size of the source of light. For example, you can have what we call as being you can have what we call as being a pinpoint source of light. So you can have a pinpoint source of light, meaning a very small source of light that you can have. Let's say that you have an opaque object and there's a very small source of light in this case. In this case, we're talking about a pinpoint source of light. And let me say this side I do have what I'm calling as being a screen. What is going to happen? Well, much of the light may pass through the side of the object. The light may pass through the side of the object because this is what I'm calling as being an opaque object. You are going to find that much of the light that will be falling somewhere here is actually going to be, it is actually going to be obstructed. In other words, it will not pass through. But light passing this side is going to pass through, and therefore here in this region, you are going to have, a shadow. So that is going to be dark. So on your screen, if this is the screen that you had, you are going to find that, this region that we are going to have somewhere here, you are going to have this whole area is simply going to be very dark. So this whole region here is going to be very dark. So that dark part that is actually created is what we call as being the umbra. So you need to remember that, the word umbra. So what exactly is umbra? Or umbra is simply the darkest shadow that is created. So let me just write a point here. So when we talk about umbra, what exactly is umbra? So we simply mean is the darkest. So if you want, you can say is the darkest shadow. Now what we mean when we say it's a darkest shadow, it simply means that no light is actually falling on it. And it is true, this region here that I've marked in blue, there's no light that is falling here, but light is falling in this direction and that direction. So the darkest shadow, where no little light falls on it, that is what we call as being umbra. So remember, this can be created sometimes when you have a pinpoint source of light. You are going to create, an umbra. Suppose you have got a wider source of light. Suppose you have got maybe a wider, if you want, you can simply say, suppose you have got a broader, source of light. Then what is going to happen? And between, you have got an opaque object. But let's say that we have got a broader source of light like this one. Then I do have an object along the way, which is simply an opaque, object that we do have. And let's say that somewhere here we do have a screen where we are seeing, we want to see what is happening. If that is a broader or a wider source of light that you have there, what is going to happen? Well, some light may be able to pass through in that direction. It may be able to pass through also in that, direction. Some of the light may also, pass through in this direction, and it may also pass through in that direction. So that is what you're going to see. Now you can see that what is going to happen is that, this region, which I'm going to shade in blue, you are going to find that there is no light that is going to fall on it. Then the one that I'm dotting in that direction, there will be some light, but also there's going to be some, there's going to be some darkness that is there. In other words, the one that I've actually dotted is not going to be completely dark because some light is actually falling on it. But the one that I've painted blue, it simply means it will be completely dark. So therefore, the one that I've dotted is what we simply call as being the penumbra. So if you have heard of the penumbra, and the one that I've painted in blue there, that is what we call as being the umbra. So if I was to illustrate it there, you are going to find that this point here is going to be very dark, and you are going to have another point there. So what you are going to see on the screen, this is the blue section, and that surrounding it is the dotted line. So the middle part, which is very dark, this is what we are calling as being the umbra. And the one that is dotted where some light is falling, that is what we are calling as being the penumbra. So what exactly is the penumbra? How can we define what penumbra is? Well, penumbra is a partial, if you want, you can simply call it as being a partial shadow that is actually going to be created. So a partial shadow, why? Because some light is actually falling on it, and that is why we call it as being a partial shadow. Now, when it comes to the formation of umbra and penumbra, this actually gives a rise to what we simply call as being, you might have heard of what we call as being, eclipse. You might have heard of what we are calling as being an eclipse. Now, when does an eclipse occur? Well, if it comes to an eclipse, eclipse actually occurs as the earth and moon align themselves in position, which cast shadows on each other. So an eclipse is actually going to be formed when either the earth and the moon align along each other and they can cast shadow along each other. Then an eclipse is actually going to be created. No wonder when it comes to eclipse, sometimes you might have heard of what we call as being, eclipse of, the sun. What do they mean when they say eclipse of the sun? Well, an eclipse of the sun, which can also be known as being, solar, eclipse. Yeah, so solar eclipse actually, happens, when the moon, comes between. So when the moon comes between, the sun and earth. So that is when that is going to be created, eclipse of the sun, or what we call as being solar eclipse. So what I mean is that if you have got the sun here, let me say you have the sun, and let me say that you have the moon slightly smaller, so you have the moon and you have the earth in this case here. So when the moon comes between the sun and the earth, what is going to be created is what we simply call as being, solar eclipse, or eclipse of the sun. So again, when shadows are actually created, what you're going to see is that there will be a point. Let me just show you in this case as light, travels. So you are going to find that as light travels, there will be a point where you are going to find that, again, the region that I'm painting blue, you are going to find that this is the region that we are calling as being umbra, where a person standing in that region will be able to see total darkness. That's umbra. But a person that is standing in the dotted line this side, where some light is falling, a person standing in that direction will be able to see a partial darkness, and that is what we call as being a penumbra. So eclipse of the sun, let me just give you another adjustment to what we call as being eclipse of the moon. So you can also have eclipse of the moon, but when does eclipse of the moon actually take place? So eclipse of the moon is what is also known as being, lunar eclipse. So when does it happen? Well, this lunar eclipse actually occurs, maybe I can say occurs when the earth, so it occurs when the earth, comes between the sun and the moon. So when the earth comes between the sun and the moon, what is actually created is what we call as being, eclipse of the moon. So what I mean is that you have the sun here, so you do have the sun, and you do have the earth there, then you do have the moon in that direction. So because light is coming from there, a shadow is going to be cast on there, is actually going to be cast on the moon, and that is why we simply call it in that case as being the eclipse of the moon. So you can see formation of shadows actually result in the formation of eclipse that we're able to appreciate depending on the position where we are standing from. Thank you so much for watching. Watch out for some other videos so that you can get to learn more.